It began with a single, neatly folded envelope slipped under the front door, resting there like an uninvited guest. The envelope was cream-colored with a sharp crease and smelled faintly of some overly sweet floral perfume. No name was printed on it, only a handwritten scrawl across the front that read, "Important." That was my first clue this wasn't going to be good news. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in bold, blocky font. The tone was curt, almost militaristic. It stated, without greeting or explanation, that my truck was a visual nuisance and needed to be moved from the driveway immediately. It was signed only with the name Karen, my neighbor from 2 houses down. Karen was known in the neighborhood, not in the way some people are, remembered for their kindness or their willingness to lend a hand, but for her constant watchfulness. She didn't just live on our street, she monitored it, like a self-appointed warden of suburban aesthetics. If a garbage bin lingered too long at the curb, Karen noticed. If a child's bicycle lay in a yard overnight, Karen noticed. And if she noticed, she acted. The problem was, my truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was my workhorse. A heavy-duty pickup with mud-streaked tires, a dent or two along the side, and a stubborn engine that roared to life each morning. I ran a small home renovation business, and this truck was essential. It carried lumber, hauled tools, and often came back from job sites coated in dust and grit. Karen didn't see a hard day's work when she looked at it. She saw an eyesore, and now apparently she saw a reason to demand it be gone. I set the letter aside, more annoyed than alarmed. Neighbors had their opinions, and I had my property rights. I figured this would be the end of it, a passive-aggressive attempt to intimidate me into compliance. But I underestimated Karen's persistence. 2 days later, the second letter came. This time, it was slipped into my mailbox, even though it wasn't stamped or officially mailed. The font was larger, the wording sharper. She claimed my truck degraded the property values of the neighborhood and threatened to escalate the matter if I didn't move it within 48 hours. The escalation began sooner than that. On the third morning, I woke to find her standing at the end of my driveway, phone in hand, photographing my truck from multiple angles. She didn't acknowledge me when I stepped outside. She simply snapped her pictures, turned on her heel, and marched away. It was the first time I realized she wasn't just trying to convince me, she was building a case. Later that week, I received a formal notice from the HOA. It wasn't as venomous in tone, but the message was the same: move the truck. It cited vague aesthetic guidelines and warned of possible fines. I called the HOA office, expecting a reasonable discussion, but the representative was hesitant. "We've received several complaints," they said. Several. That meant Karen had rallied others, or at least claimed she had. The fines started almost immediately. $50 for non-compliance the first week. Another $50 the next. The letters from Karen kept coming too, each one more self-righteous than the last. I ignored them all. But Karen wasn't satisfied with fines. She wanted a victory she could parade around the neighborhood, a public humiliation that would prove she was right, and she knew exactly how to get it. 2 weeks later, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. This one bore the seal of the county courthouse. Karen had filed a civil complaint, claiming my truck violated local ordinances and requesting a court order to have it removed. It was absurd. It was also very real. I read the document twice, feeling the slow, burning anger that comes when someone mistakes your patience for weakness. The date was set. I would see her in court. What I didn't realize was that Karen had already begun spinning her own version of events to the neighbors. She painted herself as the victim, forced to take legal action because of my reckless disregard for the community's rules. I caught snippets of whispered conversations when I walked my dog. Doors closed a little faster when I passed. She was laying the groundwork for a public showdown, and she expected to win. But Karen had made a mistake. She assumed that because I hadn't fought back yet, I wouldn't fight back at all. She thought her intimidation tactics would work in a courtroom, the way they did over the fence. She was wrong. As the court date approached, I began to gather my own evidence. I reviewed the HOA bylaws, county ordinances, and property codes. I photographed my truck from every possible angle, noting how it was parked neatly, well within the property line, and not blocking any public access. I found records of other neighbors with large vehicles, SUVs, vans, and even a boat that had never faced complaints or fines. I knew exactly what Karen was doing, targeting me personally, not enforcing any actual rule. The more I prepared, the more confident I became. And the more confident I became, the more Karen's smugness grew. She thought I was preparing for defeat. I was preparing for something else entirely. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse early. The building's cold marble halls and echoing. Footsteps made everything feel heavier, more serious. Karen was already there, dressed in a crisp blouse and clutching a thick folder of papers. She didn't look at me, but I could feel her satisfaction radiating across the room. As we waited for our case to be called, I noticed the courtroom filling with people. Some were strangers, but a few faces from the neighborhood stood out. They had come to watch. Whether they were here to support her or just witness the drama, I didn't know. When the clerk finally called our case, we walked forward together, the air between us tense. The judge, an older man with a calm but sharp gaze, glanced between us and motioned for Karen to begin. She launched into her story about how my truck was unsightly, how it ruined the appearance of the street, and how she had no choice but to take legal action for the sake of the neighborhood. I listened quietly, waiting for my turn. By the time she finished, the judge was already raising an eyebrow. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to present my evidence. What happened next would become the moment. People in our neighborhood talked about for years. Chapter 2, The Case Unravels. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he glanced over Karen's folder. His eyes lingered on a few photographs before shifting to me. His tone was neutral, but the faint arch of his brow suggested he already had questions. I began with the simplest fact. My truck was parked on my own property. I laid out aerial photos from the county's public record system, showing clear boundary lines and measurements. My driveway was well within code, and the truck didn't extend a single inch past it. The judge nodded, marking something down on his notepad. Next, I presented the HOA's own bylaws. I had highlighted the sections on vehicle storage and parking, and nowhere did it mention restrictions against pickup trucks. The only stipulations involved abandoned or inoperable vehicles, neither of which apply to mine. I could see Karen shifting in her seat. Her confidence was faltering, but she still tried to maintain a composed expression. Then came the photos of other properties. I had documented SUVs, RVs, vans, and boats, many of them larger and more obstructive than my truck. I explained that no citations had been issued to those owners. This wasn't about enforcing a rule. It was selective targeting. The judge glanced at Karen. "Do you have evidence that these other vehicles received similar notices?" he asked. She shuffled her papers but produced nothing. That small hesitation didn't go unnoticed, I continued. I had even obtained the county's official parking and nuisance ordinances. None prohibited a licensed, operable vehicle from being parked in a residential driveway. I pointed out the exact clauses, the language so plain that even someone unfamiliar with legal jargon could understand it. As I spoke, I noticed subtle changes in the room. Some of the neighbors who had come to watch were leaning forward, eyebrows raised. A few exchanged glances. The narrative Karen had been spinning was unraveling, and they were watching it happen in real time. Karen tried to pivot her argument. She claimed my truck was commercial-looking and gave the impression of a construction site, which she believed was not in keeping with the neighborhood's character. The judge raised an eyebrow again and asked if she could cite any law, ordinance, or HOA clause that supported her position. She couldn't. She attempted another tactic, suggesting my truck made the neighborhood less safe because it could be used to hide suspicious activity. That was the moment the judge let out a short, almost incredulous laugh, not mocking, but as if he'd heard this kind of grasping before. "Do you have any evidence to support that claim?" he asked. Karen faltered, muttering something about common sense and visual deterrence. The tension in the room shifted. The authority she'd tried to project was slipping. I could feel the balance tipping in my favor, but I stayed calm, methodical, and precise. I knew the more composed I appeared, the more her accusations would look like petty grievances rather than legitimate concerns. Then came the most important piece of evidence, documentation of the harassment. I produced copies of every letter she had sent, the timestamps of her photographing my truck, and a log I had kept of each incident. It painted a clear picture, not of a concerned neighbor enforcing rules, but of someone obsessively targeting one resident. The judge read through the letters, his expression tightening. They were curt, demanding, and personal. Some even strayed into insult. One note in particular told me to act like a decent neighbor and stop dragging the street down with your junkyard scrap metal. It was difficult to interpret that as anything but hostile. When I finished, there was a long pause. The judge set his pen down and looked at Karen. "This seems less like a matter of ordinance violation," he said slowly, "and more like a personal dispute." Karen tried to recover, insisting that the integrity of the neighborhood was at stake, but her voice lacked the firmness it had at the start. The judge didn't look convinced. He turned back to me. "Is your vehicle in good working order?" I confirmed it was, explaining that I drove it daily for my renovation business. I even produced the most recent inspection certificate and maintenance records, proving it was safe and roadworthy. With each piece of evidence, Karen's posture deflated. Her folder, once a weapon, now sat limp in her lap. She avoided eye contact, flipping through pages as if she might find something she'd overlooked. The judge asked if I had any final statements. I kept it short. My vehicle complied with all applicable rules, ordinances, and laws. I had been unfairly targeted, and I simply wanted to be left in peace to live and work on my own property without harassment. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scratching of the judge's pen. He looked up, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in his expression that told me the outcome was inevitable, but he didn't rule immediately. Instead, he said the matter would be concluded after a brief recess. He stood, adjusted his robe, and left the bench. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as we all sat waiting. Karen's confidence was gone. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, refusing to glance my way. I could tell she knew the case had slipped out of her control. When the judge returned, it would be time for the final decision, a decision that would do more than just end this dispute. It would set the tone for the entire neighborhood. Chapter 3, The Verdict. The courtroom's atmosphere felt heavier after the recess. The quiet murmurs had faded into tense silence as the judge returned to the bench. Karen sat rigid, her shoulders squared, as if bracing for some miracle in her favor. I sat still, my hands folded, my evidence neatly stacked before me. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes sweeping briefly across the room before landing on Karen. He began by summarizing the case. Her complaint, my defense, the evidence from both sides. His voice was calm but deliberate, each point laid out like a row of stepping stones leading toward the inevitable. He acknowledged her concerns about neighborhood appearance, but quickly pointed out that concerns alone do not carry legal weight. "This court is bound by law, not preference," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Karen's face twitched, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then he turned to the facts. "My truck was legally parked on my own property. It was licensed, operable, and in compliance with both HOA bylaws and county ordinances. No rule or statute had been violated." The comparisons to other vehicles in the neighborhood were compelling, especially given that no other complaints or citations had been issued for them. This, he said, strongly suggests selective enforcement. Karen's attempt to frame the vehicle as a safety risk, he continued, was unsupported by any credible evidence. He paused after saying it, as if letting the words sink in. Several people in the audience shifted, some exchanging knowing looks. Finally, the judge addressed the letters and documented harassment. He called the tone unnecessarily hostile and indicative of a personal grievance, rather than a genuine enforcement action. His eyes lingered on her for a moment before he continued. Then came the ruling. Clear, concise, and final. The complaint was dismissed in its entirety. No fines, no removal, no conditions. My right to park my truck where it was remained fully intact. But he didn't stop there. In what felt like a deliberate choice to make a point, the judge added that future harassment of this nature could be grounds for a counterclaim, possibly, even damages if it continued. He said it plainly, without theatrics. But the message was unmistakable. Stop now or risk far worse. It was in that moment that the tension broke. There was no applause, no cheering, just the unmistakable sound of quiet satisfaction from those who had been waiting for someone to stand up to her. Karen's face was frozen in an expression. That was equal parts disbelief and embarrassment. She gathered her papers slowly, as though every movement was a conscious effort not to betray her frustration. The judge dismissed us, and the room began to empty. I collected my own documents, careful not to rush, feeling the weight of the victory settle in. As I left the courtroom, I could hear low whispers behind me. Some were just neighbors, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd just witnessed. Others were quieter still, as if they didn't want me to hear their approval. In a neighborhood where Karen's disapproval had carried so much influence, the shift in tone was unmistakable. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper, the air cleaner. I walked to my truck, still parked exactly where it had been all along, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the eyes of disapproval on me. The vehicle stood there, sturdy and unapologetic, a reminder that not every battle was worth avoiding. But Karen was not the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. I knew it the moment I saw her exit the courthouse, her expression already sharpening into something colder. She didn't look at me, but she didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't over. Over the following days, the shift in the neighborhood became more visible. A few neighbors who had avoided me before now offered small nods as I passed. Others lingered in conversation at their mailboxes, just long enough to make it obvious they were no longer afraid of being seen talking to me. Karen, on the other hand, retreated from public view. I didn't see her patrolling the street with her phone, nor did I receive any more letters. But every time I glanced toward her house, I caught the sense that she was watching from somewhere unseen. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps the courtroom humiliation had been enough to put an end to it, that maybe she'd finally realized the futility of her campaign against me. I was wrong. Her silence was not surrender, it was planning. And the next move she made would escalate, our feud far beyond anything a courtroom could contain. The first sign came one morning when I stepped outside and noticed something strange about my truck. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint, sticky residue along the driver's side door handle. It was the beginning of the next chapter in a war neither of us had chosen wisely, but both of us were now determined to win. Chapter 4. The Retaliation. The residue on my truck door wasn't the kind of thing you could mistake for an accident. It was thick, syrupy, and had begun to harden in the early morning sun. It clung stubbornly to the paint, sticky enough to coat my fingers when I touched it. Whatever it was, it had been deliberately applied. I cleaned it off, but the smell lingered, a sharp, chemical odor that reminded me of some kind of industrial adhesive. I didn't have proof, not yet, but I knew in my gut who was responsible. Karen might have lost in court, but she was far from done. The first incident could have been dismissed as petty vandalism. But then the second came, and the third. A few days later, I found a thin scratch running along the passenger side of my truck, as if someone had dragged a key down its length. It wasn't deep enough to gouge the metal, but it stood out in the sunlight, a taunting scar. A week after that, I discovered my trash bin tipped over in the middle of the driveway, its contents scattered across the concrete. The wind could have done it. Maybe. But the careful way the lid had been wedged open told another story. It was harassment, deliberate and escalating, and it didn't stop with my truck. Small things began to happen around my property. A garden hose mysteriously left running overnight, flooding the edge of my lawn. A package from an online order that never arrived. Later found dumped at the far end of the street. Even my mailbox wasn't spared. One morning I opened it to find it filled with a soggy mess of torn-up flyers and shredded paper, all jammed in until the door barely closed. I started documenting everything. Photographs, timestamps, written logs. Every incident was recorded in detail. The court ruling had made it clear that her actions could cross into legally actionable territory, and I intended to be ready if it came to that. Still, there was an unease settling over my daily routine. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the street. I found myself listening for the click of a camera, shutter, or the distant hum of a phone recording. Some nights I'd wake and glance through the blinds, half expecting to see a shadow moving across my driveway, and then one night I did. It was just past midnight when I caught it, a faint movement near the front of my truck. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a stray cat or raccoon. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw the shape resolve into something unmistakably human. A short, rigid figure, moving with deliberate caution. Karen. She was crouched low near the front bumper, fiddling with something I couldn't see from the window. My pulse quickened. I reached for my phone, quietly pressing the record button before slipping toward the door. By the time I stepped outside, she was already halfway back to her house, her pace quickening as she disappeared inside. When I checked the truck, I found the license plate screws loosened, one of them barely holding on. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was dangerous. If the plate had fallen off while I was driving, I could have been pulled over or fined. That was the turning point. The petty vandalism was one thing, but tampering with my vehicle crossed a different line. I took the video to the police station the next day, filing a formal report. The officer I spoke with was polite but cautious. Without catching her in the act of actual damage, it would be difficult to press charges. Still, the report went on record, and I made sure they knew about the history between us. Karen must have sensed that I'd taken the matter further, because the next week the harassment stopped, at least for a while. But her absence from direct action didn't mean she was done. She simply shifted tactics. Instead of targeting my property outright, she began a campaign of whispers. At first, it was subtle, neighbors avoiding eye contact, conversations halting when I approached. Then, one afternoon, I overheard two people at the community mailbox discussing the guy with the truck and how dangerous it looked parked there all the time. The phrases sounded eerily familiar, almost like lines taken straight from Karen's courtroom speech. She wasn't vandalizing anymore. She was working on isolating me socially, twisting the story so that the court's dismissal became irrelevant in the minds of those who heard only her version. It was clever in its own way. Damage to property could be repaired. Damage to reputation was far trickier. But what Karen hadn't counted on was that I still had the advantage of proof. I had the video. I had the logs. And I had something she didn't, patience. Because while she was busy poisoning the well, I was setting the stage for something she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of. The opportunity came sooner than I expected, and it began with a single envelope in my mailbox. One not from Karen, but from the HOA itself. Inside was a notice. Karen had filed another complaint. This time it wasn't about the truck. It was about me. Chapter 5, the HOA weapon. The HOA notice was printed on thick white paper, its logo pressed in glossy ink at the top. The tone was polite but unmistakably formal. The kind of carefully neutral language that hides the true intent between the lines. It informed me that a series of behavioral complaints had been lodged against me, and that the association would be reviewing my compliance with community standards. Behavioral complaints. Not about the truck, not about property maintenance. This was personal. The letter didn't name Karen, but I didn't need a signature to recognize her handiwork. She'd abandoned the direct. Attacks in favor of something more. Insidious, turning the HOA itself into her proxy. By lodging complaints about me as a person rather than my property, she could sidestep the court's ruling entirely. The letter requested my attendance at a compliance hearing, scheduled for the following week. No details were given about the nature of the complaints, beyond vague accusations of disruptive conduct and failure to contribute to neighborhood harmony. It was the kind of language designed to be open-ended, giving the board maximum flexibility to interpret it however they wished. I knew immediately what she was trying to do. In a courtroom, she had to argue by the letter of the law. With the HOA, the rules were looser, more subjective. A vote from a handful of board members, some of whom she likely had in her pocket, could saddle me with restrictions, fines, or worse. But Karen had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed I'd walk into that meeting unprepared. Over the next several days, I gathered everything. The police report, the video of her tampering with my license plate, the log of vandalism incidents, photographs, and most importantly, the court's dismissal of her original complaint. I compiled it into a binder thick enough to make a statement the moment I set it down on the table. The night of the hearing arrived with the tense stillness of a brewing storm. The HOA's meeting room was a converted community. Center space, fluorescent lighting, folding chairs, and a long table at the front where the board members sat. Karen was there, of course, positioned near the center like a guest of honor. She wore the same crisp, self-satisfied look she'd carried into court, though I noticed a flicker of recognition when she saw the binder under my arm. The meeting began with procedural announcements, a thin veil of normalcy before the main event. When it was my turn, one of the board members read aloud the list of complaints. They were as ridiculous as they were predictable. Allegations that I was uncooperative with community initiatives, that my presence caused discomfort among certain residents, that my truck attracted the wrong type of attention to the street. The phrasing was deliberately subjective, impossible to disprove outright, because it wasn't based on measurable actions. It was about perception. But that subjectivity worked both ways. When they asked for my response, I didn't start with my own defense. I started with a history lesson. I laid out the timeline, the first letter from Karen, the escalating harassment, the courtroom case, and its dismissal. I didn't need to raise my voice. The quiet recitation of documented facts carried more weight than any emotional argument could. Then I placed the binder on the table and slid it toward the board. Inside was every photo, every timestamp, every incident logged and cross-referenced. I showed them the police report, the video evidence, and the judge's written decision. I explained, point by point, how the current complaints were part of the same pattern, an ongoing campaign of harassment, dressed up as neighborhood concern. The room shifted as I spoke. Board members who had been leaning toward Karen's side straightened in their seats. A few began flipping through the pages of the binder, their expressions changing as the pattern became undeniable. Karen tried to interrupt, insisting I was twisting events and making her look bad. But the board president cut her off with a sharp tap of the gavel. "You'll have your turn," he said, his voice clipped. When her turn came, she fell back on the same vague language. She spoke of the spirit of the community, of protecting property values, and of maintaining standards. But without evidence, her words hung in the air like smoke, visible for a moment before dissipating. When the board retired to deliberate, the room was silent except for the shuffling of papers. Karen avoided looking at me, but I could see the tension in her posture. She wasn't confident anymore. After what felt like an eternity, the board returned. The president spoke for the group. The complaints were dismissed for lack of evidence. Furthermore, the board would be monitoring any future complaints for patterns of harassment, a thinly veiled warning directed squarely at her. It was another win, and a bigger one than she'd expected me to get. But victory came with a realization. Karen wasn't going to stop, just because she lost twice. She was the kind of person who saw defeat as a challenge to escalate further. And I was right. Within days, a new problem emerged. It wasn't a letter or a fine or vandalism. It was something quieter, harder to confront directly. Someone, no points for guessing who, had begun calling the police. Not once, not twice, but over and over. Noise complaints, suspicious vehicle reports, anonymous tips. Karen had found a new weapon, and this one could do more damage than all the others combined. Chapter 6. The Police Calls. The first knock came on a Thursday evening. 2 uniformed officers stood on my porch, their cruiser idling at the curb, red and blue lights flashing against the siding. The lead officer explained there had been a noise complaint, reports of loud music and disturbances coming from my property. I invited them in to listen. The house was quiet. No music, no TV, nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator. They exchanged glances, took my statement, and left with an apologetic tone. Probably a misunderstanding, one said. But I already knew there was no misunderstanding. The second call came 3 days later. This time it was about a suspicious vehicle in my driveway, my truck, the same one that had been the center of every dispute with Karen. The officer explained that an anonymous caller had reported it as abandoned. I showed him the registration, the keys in my hand, and the fresh inspection sticker. He left quickly, looking mildly annoyed, not with me, but with whoever kept wasting his time. By the third call, the irritation was visible. It was late on a Sunday night when the pounding on the door jolted me awake. Another noise complaint. I was alone, half asleep, with no music, no TV, no visitors, just me and the steady chirp of the smoke detector in the hallway. The officer who took the report glanced over my shoulder toward the street and muttered something about this same address again. The pattern was obvious. Karen had shifted her strategy. She wasn't trying to damage my property now, she was trying to create a record. A paper trail of police interactions that could be twisted into a narrative. Look, the police are always at his house. He must be trouble. It was a tactic built on persistence and perception. Even if nothing came of the calls, The constant flashing lights and officer visits sent a message to anyone watching. I started documenting those too. Dates, times, officer names, case numbers. Every detail went into the same growing binder. But the binder wasn't enough anymore. I needed to get ahead of her. So I went to the police station, this time not to file a report, but to speak directly with the community liaison officer. I laid it all out. The court case, the HOA hearing, the harassment, the vandalism, and now the series of false complaints. I showed them the video, the logs, the dismissed rulings. I didn't just want the officers to know the truth. I wanted it on record, officially, that the calls were part of an ongoing feud. The liaison officer listened carefully, flipping through my binder. When I finished, she told me something that shifted my thinking entirely. Repeated false reports weren't just annoying, they could be considered misuse of emergency services, and in some cases, harassment or even a misdemeanor offense. That was the opening I needed. The next call came a week later, and this time, the responding officer already knew the situation. He took the report, but before leaving, he added something quietly. "We're starting to see the pattern, too." Karen must have realized the police weren't playing along anymore, because the calls stopped abruptly after that visit. But her retreat didn't bring relief, it brought something worse. The silence. Karen's quiet wasn't the absence of action. It was the calm before her next move. She'd tried letters, fines, vandalism, the HOA, and the police. Each had failed. The only thing left was something more dramatic. Something that could tip the balance in her favor if it worked. It came without warning. One Tuesday morning, I opened my mailbox to find a thick manila envelope with no return address. Inside were photographs of me, working in my yard, walking my dog, loading tools into my truck, even one taken at the grocery store parking lot. All from a distance, all clearly taken without my knowledge. There was no note, no demand, just the photographs. It was no longer about the truck. It was about me. Chapter 7, The Final Confrontation. The photographs stayed spread across my kitchen table for hours. Each one felt heavier than paper should, like it carried the weight of something darker. These weren't the careless snapshots of a nosy neighbor peeking over a fence. They were deliberate, framed, timed, and taken from multiple locations. Some were from public streets, but others were clearly shot from vantage points that suggested trespassing. The thought of Karen following me, watching me at the store, lingering at the edge of my driveway, it made my skin crawl. And yet, the absence of a note or explanation made it more unnerving. It wasn't a demand for money or a warning to move my truck. It was a silent message. "I'm watching you." The line had been crossed. That night, I pulled up the footage from my security cameras and combed through the days and times I'd been photographed. Twice I caught glimpses of her, not on my property but hovering nearby, her phone angled toward me. One clip showed her standing across the street as I loaded lumber into my truck. Another captured her walking, slowly past my yard with a camera strap hanging from her neck. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it was enough to escalate. The next morning, I went back to the police station with the envelope of photographs, the camera footage, and my binder of meticulously logged incidents. The officer I met with took his time, flipping through the images, checking the timestamps, and asking questions about where I'd been. This time, the tone was different. This wasn't a neighbor dispute anymore. It was harassment, potentially stalking. The officer explained that with enough evidence, the court could issue a restraining order. That would mean Karen would have to keep her distance from me, my property, and ironically, my truck. I filed the paperwork that day. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, Karen's presence became louder, not quieter. She'd linger outside longer when I came home. She'd accidentally leave her garbage bins in front of my driveway. And sometimes, late at night, I'd see her blinds twitching, just enough to catch the faint glow of her phone screen. But I didn't react, not yet. When the court date arrived, I walked into the small county courtroom, with my binder in one hand and the manila envelope in the other. Karen was already seated at the respondent's table, her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look at me, but she didn't need to. I could feel the weight of her glare. The judge began by asking me to explain the situation. No dialogue, no drama, just facts. I laid it all out in chronological order. The HOA complaints, the vandalism, the false police calls, and now the stalking photographs. I submitted the binder and the envelope into evidence, each page and image meticulously labeled and time-stamped. When it was Karen's turn, she launched into a string of accusations about my truck being an eyesore, about neighborhood safety, about suspicious activity. But without evidence, her words hung in the air, unsupported. Then the judge flipped through the photographs, pausing on one where I was clearly unloading groceries from my truck while Karen's reflection was faintly visible in the window of a nearby parked car. He looked up, his expression almost amused. "Ms. At last name," he said slowly. "These were taken by you, were they not?" Karen stammered, her face reddening. She muttered about documenting neighborhood concerns, but the judge didn't look convinced. He set the photos down, leaned back and gave a short, incredulous laugh, not cruel, but the kind of laugh that says, "I've seen enough of this nonsense." The restraining order was granted. Karen was ordered to stay at least 100 feet away from me, my property, and my truck for the next 2 years. Any violation would result in immediate arrest. The judge even made a pointed remark about wasting court resources over personal grudges disguised as community concerns. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months. But I also knew that while the legal battle was over, the social one wasn't. Karen wouldn't just vanish from the neighborhood, and her pride had just taken a public hit. I expected bitterness. I expected petty acts from a distance. What I didn't expect was silence. For weeks, there were no sightings of her near my property, no notes, no calls. The blinds stayed still, the garbage bin stayed in place, and my truck sat peacefully in the driveway, untouched. It almost felt like victory, almost, until the HOA letter arrived. Chapter 8, The Last Laugh. The envelope sat in my mailbox like a relic from a past I thought I'd buried. The HOA logo, printed in smug blue at the corner, was as familiar as it was unwelcome. For a brief moment, I considered tossing it straight into the trash. But curiosity and a touch of caution won out. Inside was a formal letter, carefully worded, citing renewed concerns about the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood. The concerns were vague, but the implication was obvious. They wanted my truck gone again. The signature at the bottom made my jaw tighten. It wasn't the HOA president I'd dealt with months earlier. It was Karen. Apparently, in the vacuum of silence since the restraining order, she'd found a new outlet for her spite. She'd campaigned to get herself elected to the HOA board, and now she had an official letterhead to fuel her vendetta. I could almost admire the audacity, almost. The problem for her was that the restraining order was still very much in effect. Her new position didn't exempt her from the law. I called the police station, calmly explained the situation, and forwarded them a scanned copy of the letter. They didn't hesitate. 2 days later, I watched from my porch as a patrol car pulled up in front of her house. The officers were polite but firm. Karen stood in the doorway, her face cycling through shades of red as they spoke. After a few tense minutes, she was led to the car, handcuffs glinting in the afternoon sun. Her arrest wasn't for the HOA letter itself. It was for violating the restraining order by directly contacting me. Her new role didn't shield her from the fact that she wasn't allowed to send me anything, official or otherwise. That evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. People whispered over fences and huddled on sidewalks, some pretending not to watch as the police car drove away. A few even stopped by my driveway, not to gloat. Exactly, but to quietly acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, this whole ordeal had been as absurd as it sounded. In the weeks that followed, the HOA sent me another letter, this time from the acting president, formally apologizing for the overreach of certain members and confirming that my truck was entirely within compliance. It was the kind of bureaucratic backpedaling that didn't admit guilt but still reeked of surrender. Life settled into a strange kind of normal. My truck stayed exactly where it had always been, its presence now a silent monument to stubbornness and patience. Karen's house went quiet, blinds drawn, her car rarely moving. Word was she'd resigned from the HOA board, though whether by choice or by pressure, no one knew for sure. Months passed, and the tension in the air thinned. The petty battles, the envelopes, the court dates, they all faded into memory, replaced by the simple rhythm of everyday life. But the lessons lingered. Some neighbors fight over noise, others over fences, But the war over my truck had been something else entirely. A clash of pride, control, and sheer persistence. In the end, I hadn't just kept my driveway the way I wanted. I'd shown that some battles, when fought with enough patience and proof, could be won completely. One crisp Saturday morning, I stood in the driveway with a mug of coffee, the sun catching the chrome of my truck. The street was quiet, the air still, and for the first time in over a year, I realized there was no one watching me. No blinds twitching, no camera lenses glinting, no threats hidden in HOA stationery. Just peace, and maybe, in its own strange way, that was the sweetest revenge of all.